Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, afternoon, wherever you are tuning in from. So this is Minjing. I'm the new executive director of for ACMS, and just started my job this month. We're really happy to see you all joining today. So ACMS is a nonprofit educational organization that works to strengthen and deepen academic and cultural connections between United States and Mongolia. So some of you may know of our tradition of hosting a speaker series event twice a month at the Natsukdorj Library here in Ulaanbaatar to help share research that is being done on Mongolia. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic-related restrictions, we have not been able to host our event since January. Some of you may know that we did our very first virtual speaker series in April. So I'm pleased to welcome you to our next virtual speaker series. So if you'd like to be informed about our future sessions, or you can either subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon to receive personalized notifications, or you can join our mailing list. So we will post the link end of today's speaker series. So we encourage you and your organizations to become a member of ACMS. So your membership dues support programs like speaker series and other scholarships. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of our virtual speaker series, Dr. Marissa Smith. Dr. Smith is a Mongolia expert who has conducted extensive research in the country and has written on a wide range of contemporary Mongolian issues, including politics, sovereignty, labor, contemporary socialism, mobile pastoralism, international cooperations, and relations between Russians and Mongolians. She completed her PhD in anthropology at the Princeton University in 2015 and has taught anthropology and world history and conducted training during extended field research trips in remote areas of Mongolia. She is currently affiliated with the Central Asia Working Group, UC Berkeley's Institute of East Asian Studies, and sits on the governing board of American Center for Mongolian Studies. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Smith. So you have the stage now, well, virtual stage.
Thank you, Dr. Boler-Setzik, and thanks to everyone for joining the event. Quickly about our format. So we have 4 speakers today, and we're going to hear from each of them in turn for 15 to 20 minutes or so. And then after that, there will be a question and answer session. So I'm going to be collecting questions as we go. So please feel free to go ahead and put those in the Zoom chat feature, or you can also direct message me. Also, as a quick reminder, please go ahead and mute yourself if you haven't, if you're not speaking. And I will also be introducing each speaker right before they give their talk. So to get right into it, our first speaker is Dr. Carolyn Humphrey from the University of Cambridge. And the title of her presentation is Remembering La Baksh as a Teacher. Dr. Carolyn Humphrey is an anthropologist who has researched a wide range of themes, including Soviet and post-Soviet provincial economy and society, Buryat and Daur shamanism, Jain religion and ritual, trade and barter in Nepal, environment and pastoral economy in Mongolia, and the history and contemporary situation of Buddhism, especially in Inner Mongolia. Currently, she is completing a project on sociopolitical interactions on the Russian-Mongolian-Chinese border. I think that may be completed now, I'm not sure. Her most recent books are A Monastery in Time, Making of Mongolian Buddhism, and yes, Trust and Mistrust in the Economies of the China-Russia Borderlands in 2018. Thank you, Dr. Humphrey. So I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to everybody who's organized this and giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about my teacher. It's a real pleasure. And this is going to be quite a personal sort of account. So when I was doing fieldwork in Buryat in Russia in 1967, way back, people said to me, "You're asking all these questions about our culture, but we've become very Russified. What you need to do is to go to Mongolia and do something much better over there." Well, actually, I was interested in the Buryats themselves, even if they were Russified. But still, they pushed me to see that I did indeed actually have to study Mongolian and the wider culture to which the Buryats belonged. So when I got back to UK, I tried to find out where I could learn Mongol. And there was a choice, in fact, of two places. There was Charles Borden in London at SOAS, who I heard taught kind of historical translation of historical texts. And there was Owen Lattimore, who was starting a new program in Leeds, and that focused on present day life and present day language, as it were. And this was the late 60s. This was a period of the Cold War, of course. And what Lattimore stood for, as opposed to Borden, was really getting the chance to understand the actually existing socialist society. So, of course, I chose Leeds. Now, I was in the middle of my PhD at this time in Cambridge, and having enrolled for this diploma course at Leeds, I traveled up there for a few days every week. I stayed with a landlady in a very distant suburb, and I caught a bus which was filled with smoking workmen to get to the classes each day. And Leeds was a really unfamiliar place for me at that time. The sort of red brick houses, the meals people ate, the way people talked, and their warmth and friendliness compared with Cambridge. Now, there were just three of us on this course. One of them was John Gibbons, who was preparing to become a Methodist missionary in Mongolia. And the other was, I think, a psychologist, whose name I'm afraid I've forgotten, though Judith may remember. And so the three of us sat there, and we were taught language by Urgunga Onam, and history and politics and economics by Owen Lattimore, or as we called him, Labaksh, which was the way that Urgunga talked about him. So the diploma, as I remember, was a trial run for the new MA in Mongolian Studies that was to be set up the next year in the China in East Asia department. The whole thing was great fun, and we swung backwards and forwards between Urgunga's jokes and Labaksh's wisecracks. With Urgunga, we struggled through Hangin's basic course in Mongolian. And of course, many of you will know that Hangin came along with Urgunga to be with Labaksh in the United States. I have to say that linguistically speaking, we didn't get very far towards actual spoken half Mongolian, because this textbook was a basic formal grammar, and in my view, missed out quite a lot of what people actually say. And what with Urgunga being a Daur, we somehow missed out on colloquial language. But at that time, of course, I didn't realize that. And I loved it. I loved tussling with this unfamiliar structure and vocabulary of Mongolian. Well, my goal was to learn present-day Mongolian, but what I found when I got to Labaksh's classes was infinitely more than that. I discovered to my delight that Lattimore was a great comparative historian with a breadth of vision that was unprecedented in my very limited experience. And he taught, of course, from his books and papers on frontier history. And so here I learned for the first time of his concept of the frontier as a zone of economic and ethnic and even political mixing and fluidity. As he taught, frontiers were not all the same. There were differences between those of the sea-oriented states like Britain or United States and those of landed empires like Russia and China. And then the Russian and Chinese ones differed too. What I remember in particular, in fact, was his classes on the frontiers involving Mongolia, which had Russia to the north, of course, and inland Chinese different type of frontier on the south. So the Chinese frontier occurred at the edges of the Mongolian plateau at the very point where irrigated agriculture, which supplied food to very dense populations and small towns, became uneconomic. In other words, the labor of digging and maintaining irrigation channels and keeping them going amid raids from pastoral nomads and periodic famines just became not worth it. And so what you got were fluctuations of population, including the relatively little studied move of some Han Chinese into the pastoral economy, and the larger phenomenon of Mongols moving into the settled village life. And as Labakh taught us, culturally and politically, the Chinese attitude was one of assimilation of the population in this whole kind of shifting zone into the sphere of the great empire. To the north, by contrast, the Russians and the hybrid bands of Cossacks spread east to all areas where a different type of agriculture, rainfall agriculture, was possible. And this was always supplemented by hunting and fishing and gathering and the use of forest resources. Now that mode of life also gave way when it got to Mongolia, to the dry steppe lands. But historically, that rainfall agriculture spread incredibly fast along rivers all the way across Siberia. But it was relatively unproductive and supported a very thin population and only a tiny ruling elite. So as a result, the Russians, their policy had to be really, they had no choice but to incorporate the various indigenous peoples along the way in Siberia, more or less as they were. They couldn't change them very much. So they did that rather than attempting to assimilate them to Muscovite culture. I remember being really very amazingly impressed by this analysis of the concept as a fluid frontier and by this contrast between assimilation on the one hand and incorporation on the other. And by the way, I think those ideas are still relevant to today in that part of the world. Now, if you recall Lattimore's writings, you'll remember that these Inner Asia accounts are only part of a much wider project, which was to analyze the dynamics of human history, really, in terms of movements of populations in space and time, with a vision of global ecology-influenced history, as opposed to the kind of history mostly that was done in his time in the 30s and 40s, as opposed to a more ethnocentric, Eurocentric, politically based account. Now, William Rowe has written an interesting article on Lattimore. He's a professor of history at Lattimore's old university, Johns Hopkins, and he describes this kind of very ambitious comparative work as audacious, that's the word he uses, and he writes that it's largely disappeared from sinological scholarship and history more generally. But I think that's not entirely true. I'm thinking, for example, about the work of James Scott, the influential professor of political science at Yale. Now, I think that Scott, I've never talked to him about Lattimore, but I think he probably disapproves of some aspects of Lattimore's work, particularly his rather period quasi-evolutionary language. But I think he does share the broad vision of this continent-wide historical processes and the influence in geography that Lattimore had. And I think, for example, that Scott's concept of these prickly, feisty refuge areas on the fringes of the Chinese imperial polity, which he called zomias, probably owes a great deal to Lattimore's work. Well, in class, I used to like Laobax's digs at both the Russian and the Chinese narratives of the superiority of their agricultural-based economies over what they termed at that time the primitive herding of the Mongols. Lattimore was quite different. He loved and respected the Mongols, and he used to explain to us how their pastoralism was actually not just practical and productive in multiple ways, but also highly specialized, farsighted, and wise in experience. I remember one quip of his: turn the question on ourselves, he said. Do we say that the American rancher is culturally inferior to the American farmer? I should add that though Laobax liked to make global comparisons, and although he made general points, he would argue, for example, he would argue that these people in Inner Asia who like to think of themselves as pure, ethnically pure people, actually, all of them mixed in descent and very heterogeneous. So he would make that kind of general point, but he avoided giving homilies about his own political views, and he never grumbled about his own fate in the United States. I do not ever remember him referring in class to the McCarthy episode when he was accused of being a Soviet spy. When he did talk about the Soviet Union or communist China, he preferred kind of earthy examples and personal reminiscences to any kind of grand pronouncements. And that, I think, was a great attitude to take as a teacher, because it left us students to draw our own conclusions. And I think it chimes also with what I think of is his best book. At least it's the best book to us anthropologists. And that is Mongol Journeys, which was first published in 1941. So you probably all know this book. So you'll know that it's not just a travel book. In fact, it doesn't detail a specific journey, and often it doesn't bother too much with particular places and dates. Instead, it's a real treasure trove of accumulated experiences and observations, covering an enormous variety of Mongol life as he found it in the 20s and 30s. So if you want to know about relations between servants and masters, or caravan travel, or marriage relations, or hospitality and attitudes to foreigners, or high lamas, or the horse relay system, or Mongol thinking about time and luck and chance, and a host of other things, it's all to be found in this book. And I have returned to it again and again. And every time I read it, I take pleasure in the clear, fresh language in which it's written. So to end, I'd like to mention some other aspects of Laobax as a teacher. He was quite informal, but he was always very conscientious. He gave proper long lectures full of content. He had a lovely, slow, warm American voice, which made everything very easy to understand. He was caring about his students outside the university. And in my case, for example, he made sure that I got invited to the International Congress of Mongolists in Ulaanbaatar in 1970, which was an amazing opportunity for me. because there I met very many people and made contacts that enabled me to go back to Mongolia properly for a year more than a year in 1972 to 73. And on that same visit, we had the chance to go to a wonderful trip to the Gorban-Saichen Mountains in the south of Mongolia. And I'll remember forever that the sort of brilliant light, the dryness of the air, and yet there was a stream trickling from the cliffs in these mountains. Now, Labaksh was there, and he had many, by this time, he had many cronies in Mongolia. And so they would sit around chatting, smoking comfortably, and seemingly recalling amusing events. And I remember being incredibly impressed that Labaksh was able to tell jokes in Mongolian. Well, Labaksh had a sort of tough man of the world image. I've seen it all. I've hobnobbed with presidents and general secretaries of communist parties. I'm completely used to rough conditions and dangers of the road. So that was his broad kind of persona. So I was surprised when he kindly invited me to his home near Leeds to find that he and Eleanor lived such an elegant life. His home was packed with books, and I particularly remember two large, very old, and I imagine now must be priceless, Chinese paintings of Mongols with their horses. Eleanor was a great cook, and she instructed me carefully how to cook mushrooms. On no account must you peel them. She was got a severe on that kind of front. And Labaksh would tell another of his instructive, teacherly stories of Mongol life. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed that. Next, we will go on to Dr. Nordby. So Dr. Judith Nordby will also be discussing Lattimore's work and legacy in Mongolian studies, specifically at Leeds. Dr. Judith Nordby is the former head of Mongolian studies and is now honorary fellow in Mongolian studies at the University of Leeds in England. She works on Mongolian history and contemporary affairs and undertakes consultancy work on the same. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you, and thank you, Caroline, for your talk. I'll try not to repeat it all, but what you have to say, I've heard so many times from my former colleagues and from students at Leeds. When Lattimore came to give lectures after he retired, he had the same. Had the same influence over the other students who attended at that time. They were just amazed at his articulacy, his breadth of knowledge, and the way he could put together so many ideas and reach conclusions. However, what I want to talk about is his work at the University of Leeds in the north of England. He set up the Department of Chinese Studies at the university in 1963. That department eventually became the Department of East Asian Studies, which the Mongolian embassy really appreciated. They didn't really like it being like Mongolian studies being a part of the Chinese Studies department. But let's return to Lattimore. He was ideal for this post because he had a very broad knowledge of Asian languages, years of experience of living and traveling in China, Inner Mongolia, Inner Asia. He also came with academic experience from the United States, and he'd written so many books and articles, which were not just read by academics, but they were approachable by the ordinary general reader. But he was an unusual choice for a head of department at that time, principally because he had no undergraduate degree. His parents couldn't afford for him to go to university. And another reason he was unusual was that the classical scholars of Chinese at that time in British universities were really very much opposed to his focus on contemporary language. And in fact, they even expressed the concern in a letter to the Times newspaper. Didn't make a lot of difference. And some, of course, were still rather suspicious of the charge that he'd been a communist or a Soviet spy, even though he was exonerated. Lattimore understood the importance of looking at a society and state, not in isolation, but in the context of the culture, geography, history, and regional relationships. He understood that it was important to see how the locals regarded one another and how they looked at the world beyond. And his approach, which Caroline has expanded on very much, was exactly right at this time, because Britain wanted specialists in modern Asian languages and area studies. It was the period of the Cold War, the Sino-Soviet dispute, and the nuclear arms race. But also, in 1963, Mongolia and the United Kingdom opened diplomatic relationships. So Lattimore really fitted the bill of what was needed in Asian studies. And Leeds was a very progressive university at that time, I suppose it still is. And there were several prominent scholars there who were fairly left-wing, and especially in social studies. And it was the social studies departments that Lattimore was to engage with so much while he was building up East Asian, then Chinese studies at Leeds. But he was also an international celebrity. And his inaugural lecture, which he delivered as a professor when he arrived, was actually televised on the BBC. Now, this was something that was really quite unusual at that time. And if you want to hear what he has to say, then the transcript is still accessible on the internet. If you have difficulty in finding it, then please get in touch with me. Then soon after that, and probably as a consequence of his appearance on television, he was appointed as interpreter when the first Mongolian ambassador to the United Kingdom, Dilip Baljinyam, presented his credentials to the Queen. Now, in a short, this is all recounted in a short story by the coming of the first ambassador, in a short story by a woman writer called Garamjov. You may not know of her, but that's her book anyway. Oh, we got back to front print. But she described him as an elderly Mongolist scholar sitting to the left of the Queen. Baljinyam, unfortunately, didn't say anything much about this in his memoirs, which was rather a shame. Many agree that Mongolian studies was always Owen Lattimore's first love. Derek Pritchett says that, and all my former colleagues who worked with him from the start agree. He saw his appointment at Leeds as a real opportunity to develop Mongolian studies. It was something he wasn't able to do at that time in the United States. He insisted on bringing Agunga Anon with him to Leeds, first of all to teach Chinese, but he had the definite intention of having him teach Mongolian language before very long. In 1966, well, from 66 to 67, Reginald Hibbert, the first British resident diplomat in Ulaanbaatar, became a research fellow. So he was the first start of a Mongolian studies aspect in the department. Actually, Reg and Lattimore didn't always see eye to eye in their assessment of modern Mongolia. So I think that Reg did rather keep himself to himself, but he produced some writings, which is very interesting when he was a research fellow. And other visiting scholars came to Leeds after that. But meanwhile, Lattimore was very busy lobbying the university authorities, particularly the Vice-Chancellor, which was a bit unusual. You didn't just go to the Vice-Chancellor and say, I want to do this, I want to do that, but nothing stopped Lattimore. And the postgraduate program in Mongolian studies opened in 1968 with the diploma that Caroline began on, and later on I was to do, including language, historical and contemporary studies. Then in 1969, a proper degree program with a master's program opened up, and Caroline and Derek Pritchett were the first to be awarded a master's in Mongolian studies. Now, there's a document in the university archives from that time, which says that the external examiner was extraordinarily impressed with the language skills of the two students who presented for that exam. So Caroline might like to comfort herself with that. But while all this was going on, Lattimore was also engaged in a great deal of networking to build up the prestige of Mongolian studies. He was a great letter writer. Another colleague told me the first thing he did in the morning was open his post and then answer an awful lot of them, actually by hand, not through the secretary. Importantly, he corresponded with academicians, historians from the Mongolian Academy of Sciences, Shirindev, Damdin Surin, Rinchin, Natsak Dorj. I've seen all these things in the archives in the university, and one or two of them were actually published fairly recently in this volume, Transcontinental Neighbours, Volume 1. Which actually came from Caroline's unit in Cambridge. So you can in fact read some of those letters. Lattimore also made great efforts to host Shirindev as a visiting scholar at Leeds. He was unsuccessful in that, not because of the British side, but because in the end I presume it was the party and the government that put a stop to that. But in 1970, one of his last acts as head of the department was to present Shirindev for an honorary degree at Leeds. And thus he became the first Mongolian to be awarded the honor by a Western university. Now, I'm not sure about this, but much later on, when Lattimore was himself getting an honorary degree from Leeds, this was the time that Shirindev was sacked from the Academy of Sciences, and one of the reasons given was that he had his head turned by awards and honours from foreign universities. So I suppose Leeds was partly responsible. But there you are. The first honorary degree given to a Mongolian, certainly in Britain. But Mongolian studies had no budget for library materials, so this networking was very important, and Lattimore used his contacts to establish the exchange of books, which was beneficial to both sides. He also wrote and asked Shirindev advice on how to teach Mongol Bichig, Mongol script. He visited Mongolia almost every year, I think, until from 66 to 1977, often with Agunga, and in this way he built up his own knowledge, but also perspectives on the way Mongolia was developing in that period, the real modernization of Mongolia. And there he and Agunga collected books, and some of these books were eventually translated into English. So all part of the profile of Mongolian studies at Leeds. And this, I repeat, this is not something that he had been able to do in recent years in the United States, simply because the United States and Mongolia had no diplomatic relations at the time. But it wasn't just books that were exchanged. Lattimore also facilitated the exchange of students. And the first students from Mongolia arrived in the late 60s and were supported by the United Nations. But later it was the British Council who supported them. They came to study English language at our English language unit, taking short intensive courses of about 6 months. And many Mongolians have been through this program, three or four every year. And some of them, as you're probably aware, arose to great heights in Mongolian life and society. The tutors in the language unit all agreed that these students were bright and friendly and very hardworking, and in fact they ranked them above the students coming from Eastern Europe at that time. After 1990, of course, things changed. The university structure changed in many ways, and there was no more British Council funding for these courses. But the unit did set up English for business courses at various times for Mongolian students. And the tutors themselves from the unit visited and advised the then Mongolian State University on the teaching of English as a foreign language. There was mutual exchange of language and cultural knowledge between the Mongolian students and those studying Mongolian at Leeds. So everybody gained from this arrangement. And in fact, our own students did have the option of studying at the Mongolian State University itself. Not many of them did this, but some of them did. John Gibbons, who has been mentioned, was one of them. In fact, Derek Pritchard was actually the first to go under these auspices. But we've now reached 1970, and that was the year that Owen Lattimore retired and returned to the United States. But unfortunately, this coincided almost immediately with the death of his wife, Eleanor. Now, my colleagues and others all agree that Lattimore was absolutely lost without his wife and companion of so many years. Really couldn't settle, and soon after he returned to Leeds for a time, and then periodically on many occasions, because Leeds was a place where they'd both been so happy. But Agunga was now running the Mongolian Studies program, which he did until 1985 when he retired. He was teaching the language while Lattimore turned up periodically to teach his history and contemporary studies. By this time, the program was extremely well known, not just in Britain, but abroad. We received many requests for information, commercial requests, and all kinds of requests for information about the country, because it was the only place really where you could find this out. And it even attracted diplomats. We had diplomats from Japan and the United States for training. Now William Brown, who was sent from the States, had been tipped to be the first ambassador, but then diplomatic relations were not opened in the 70s, as was expected, but he didn't waste his time. He and Agunga translated the 3rd volume of the official history of the MPR into English, a huge book, but it's still extremely useful. But Mongolian studies still had no budget of its own. The university said, well, you can have Mongolian studies, but we can't give you any money. Therefore, both Lattimore and Agunga undertook commercial jobs to keep the program going. They collaborated on a television documentary film about rural Mongolia. They undertook translation work, but they also encouraged students to take on work of this kind too, because they were keen that we should go on and perhaps make a career in Mongolian studies. And I have to say, there were times when Owen Lattimore dipped into his own pocket. Excuse me, excuse me. I've lost my place in my notes. But yeah, he dipped into his own pocket to keep the program going, or he persuaded local businessmen to do so. There was one textile manufacturer who was a regular donor to the department and to Mongolian studies. And in fact, Caroline, I do believe that he provided the funding for you to go to the conference in 1970. So he was very generous, and he was a good friend of Lattimore at that time. When Lattimore first arrived, I believe that it was intimated that he should receive an honorary degree from the university. In fact, this didn't happen until 1984, when he'd already amassed several other honorary degrees elsewhere, but he was given an honorary degree by the university. And I believe that we have David Lattimore here. And what I want to show you is a photograph that David took at that time, just before Owen went into the degree ceremony. And there he is. This is what he looked like in those days. And I have to say, that's how I looked in those days as well. So that was a very lovely occasion for the department and for all his colleagues, as well as for Lattimore and his family. But what about his legacy then? Is there a lasting legacy? He was the pioneer of area studies and contemporary language in Britain. Nothing unusual now, but it was then. The relationship he established between Britain and Mongolia made Britain and Leeds for many years the place for Mongols to come and study English language, and later undertake other forms of higher education. And in 1996, of course, we had a visit from President Ochubat, who specifically asked to come to Leeds. Lattimore made Mongolia, its life and culture, very visible in the Western world, and available, and not just to students and academics, but to the wider public. And this is something that has expanded since that time. But it's very interesting. You read things that are written now about Mongolia, and very often there's a reference to Lattimore in that in what they have to say. He made a lasting and favourable impression on most people he met. There were some people who didn't agree with him, of course, but he didn't care. I have to say, his colleagues who joined the department with him in the 1960s remained very loyal to his approach to scholarship and research, which I hope that I have done also. They accepted the importance of his notion that you must look, you must listen, and travel as the locals did. Most of these colleagues were sinologists, but they were very supportive of Mongolian studies, which is something that I appreciated very much when I was head of the program. I couldn't have continued it without their support. I was teaching it until from 1988 to 2012. Another legacy is the body of literature that he wrote. I absolutely agree on Mongol Journeys as being an absolutely wonderful and valuable book. In fact, much of what he wrote is great value today. It's many of the works are, and particularly the articles, are available on the internet, and his books have been republished more than once as well. Most of them are still available. His research interests continue at Cambridge through Caroline's efforts, who was, of course, a pioneer student of the Leeds MA. And many former Leeds students, not just of Chinese and Mongolian studies, but over the whole university, who may have taken short Mongolian studies-based courses with me in the latter years, have visited and worked in Mongolia, and or else they found their knowledge of Mongolia very useful in their careers. I still get letters and requests from students to answer questions about Mongolia, and sometimes they even provide me with jobs that provide me with a little bit of cash as well. So that is Owen Lattimore's work and legacy in Leeds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. Yeah, this is really amazing. So many holes being filled in for me, and I'm sure others as well who are familiar with many of his books and other aspects of the legacy that you and Carolyn have really talked about in depth here. So next we're going to hear from Evan Lattimore, who is one of Owen Lattimore's son. He's going to be talking about Owen Lattimore's family history in China, England, the USA, and Mongolia. So Evan Lattimore was born in New York City and raised in Providence, Rhode Island. He is a classically trained percussionist. He graduated from the New England Conservatory of Music in 1981 and went on to earn a master's degree in music education. For the past 40 years, he has traveled throughout New England and New York State, performing as a percussionist and timpanist with symphony orchestras, choruses, and musical theaters. Since 1994, Evan has taught music at the Central Tree Middle School in Rutland, Massachusetts. There he teaches band, chorus, guitar, and piano classes. He has taught classes at Brown University and Atlantic Union College and has served on the board of directors for the Worcester Youth Orchestras for 10 years. Evan and his wife, Jain, lived with Owen Lattimore in the final years of his life in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And in 2008, Evan traveled to Ulaanbaatar and the Gobi to attend the Owen Lattimore Conference at the American Center of Mongolian Studies. Okay, ready for you to speak, Evan.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the Mongolian Society for having me here. I had a wonderful time back in 2008 traveling with in Mongolia. I just wanted to start by speaking about the family history and legacy of Owen. I had 5 main points I wanted to touch on. One is McCarthy, the Dillawa, Owen as a traveler, and how the family got to China in the first place. And then, if I have time, a little epilogue on his watch. Speaking a little bit here about some of his legacy, I think he had an honorary degree from Leeds, Harvard University, and Brown University. He was the first Westerner who was inducted into the Mongolian Academy of Sciences in 1969, and he also received a Polar Star Medal for Mongolia in 1979. I think the thing that he was most proud of, which came late in his life, was that a dinosaur was named after him, a Mongolian dinosaur. I'm not even going to try and pronounce this, but you can look it up if you like. I spent the last couple of years living with him in Pawtucket with my wife. At that time, when he died, there were 4 generations of Lattimores living in Rhode Island. my father, David Lattimore, Owen Lattimore, myself, and my son, Dylan, who was born just before Owen passed away in 1989. That was a little bit unusual because the Lattimores are people who don't seem to spend much time in any one place. Currently, my brother is living in Vietnam. My sister lives in Alaska. I have another sister who lives in Iowa, a sister who lives in New Hampshire, and I'm living in Massachusetts, and along with my father, who also lives in Massachusetts. So kind of working backwards here a little bit, I'm thinking about McCarthy. In the United States, unfortunately, I think that his legacy is McCarthy. And I say that from a personal point of view. I was born in 1959, and I grew up in Providence in the 60s and went to high school in the 60s and then on to Boston in the 70s and the 80s. And during that time, I would meet people and they would say, oh, Evan Lattimore. And by the way, I've been called Owen Lattimore many times, but oh, Owen Lattimore or Evan Lattimore, are you related to Owen Lattimore? And this was, when I was younger, this happened often, very often. And it was always about McCarthy, and which I, in my later years think is sort of a sad legacy because it was such a horrible experience. However, I think as a family, we're very proud of how he handled himself. He had, handled himself with honor and dignity, and he completely eviscerated McCarthy very early on, 1950, and it was unfortunate that that went on and on and on for years and years. At the end, he was exonerated, acquitted, but he was very much persecuted, and it lasted for many years. As a family, I think the result was loss of income. He lost half of his income for lectures and that kind of thing. He lost all his savings, and he lost a beautiful piece of property up in Vermont that they had to sell in order to pay their legal bills. But in the end, he was exonerated, and he went on and he had another life after that. He went on to England, and he was able to build up a beautiful program in Leeds. The other thing I wanted to talk about was his great friendship with Dilawa. The Dilawa was a Buddhist monk that he became friends of way back in the 1930s, if not before. The Dilawa became my father's godfather, and my father was born in 1931, so that was a very long-lasting relationship. I have a picture of him here. If we can get that, there he is. And one of the books, the last book, or that I know of that he did, I think I can get this in focus, here we go, was a book that was a translation of the Dilawa's memoirs that was made by Owen and Fujiko Aisono. When I visited Mongolia, I was really surprised that when I talked to people, these were more sort of everyday people that I would meet, and I think I was trying to do, and I always have, one of Owen's legacies was to talk to people, to let them speak, ask them good questions, and if you can, speak in their language. Unfortunately, I don't speak Mongolian, but when I was in Mongolia, I was very surprised that part of his legacy was Dilawa, and that people, when I went to their homes or I would talk, and they would say, they were interested in the Dilawa, and they were interested in his relationship to the Dilawa. So that always very much impressed me. The Dilawa was a beautiful person. I think his relationship with my father was a very loving one. A godfather, but also kind of a surrogate uncle. And even with my mother, I remember many times when he would come visit us in the 60s, that those were always very happy and positive times. So the Dilawa was definitely somebody who made a big influence on Owen. For me, I always loved Owen as a traveler. He did some incredible journeys. And when I look at them, I'm just stunned at how long some of them took, and how much of the world he actually covered. there's one trip that he took back in the 1930s with his wife and son, where they were going to a conference. And the conference was at Yosemite, which is in California. But in order to get there, they took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Moscow. That alone takes, 10 days or so. Then they went on to Europe. And as we know, the trip from Europe, from Moscow to France is a long journey. Napoleon found that out the hard way. And then on to England, and then by ship to the United States, then railroad all the way across the United States. Finally, they get to their conference in Yosemite. After the conference, they continue on to San Francisco and then by boat to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii back to China. And they have gone all the way around the world, and it has taken them several months to do that. I guess that would be, nowadays we go to a conference, we get on an airplane, we complain about our layovers, our delayed flights, the terrible food, but traveling across Siberia in a train with, at the time, I think my father was suffering from various illnesses. He was a very young child. It must have been quite the experience. That was one of several trips on the Siberian Railroad. My grandmother, Eleanor, is also a great traveler. Sometimes I think that's forgotten. She started out in Chicago, Evanston, Illinois. Her father was a math professor, dean, and sometimes interim president of Northwestern University. And she, during World War I, became involved with the YWCA. She did get the Spanish flu. She spent 6 weeks in a military hospital in Montana and survived, of course. But in this time of COVID, that's something to remember. She then went to Estonia with the YWCA, set up the first YWCA in Estonia, and lobbied very hard to get a visa into what was then civil war turbulence in Russia. And she did succeed in doing that and took the Trans-Siberian Railroad across Russia, Siberia. This was 1920, 1921, and made her way to Peking, where she worked in the, she worked for it was called, what if I see it here, looking at my notes. Well, anyway, she worked for an art historian who was working on a book on Chinese ceramics, and she lived in Peking and eventually met my grandfather and married him. Their great journey together, separately and together, their honeymoon journey as an incredible journey and also a very romantic story. And it's really where it all begins. Owen has been working for Arnold and Company at that time, which was a export-import business, insurance business, and he was sent out often to the end of the railroad lines to negotiate contracts and do insurance assessments. And he this is where he really did travel by himself, learning the native languages, being able to speak to people, being able to negotiate with people, and listen to people especially. And that was one of his trademarks, I think. The journey that's in their first two books, Turkestan Reunion and Desert Road to Turkestan, when I think about it, at the amount of planning that they did, a year to plan this journey, and then going off about doing it, and really they were out for 2 years, starting with Owen walking across northern China, the Gobi, with a camel caravan. Eleanor took the Trans-Siberian Railroad around because she could not go with the camel caravans. That was taboo. There were no women allowed. And she and Owen were to meet up in the Soviet Union. However, Owen was not allowed in, and they lost communication with each other. I think at that point, she's way out there in Siberia. She has a choice of either getting back on the railroad, going back to China, or continuing on and hoping that she will actually meet up with Owen in Western China, and which she does. And she takes a dog sled ride, something like a week on a dog sled, traveling across Siberia to the Chinese border, where indeed Owen is waiting for her. And then they continue on by horse and carriage down, the western side of China. It blows my mind in a lot of ways. When we see pictures of her, for instance, it looks like she has the same outfit on for the entire journey. There are pictures of Owen at the beginning of his journey, and he looks very handsome. He has a full head of hair and a nice beard, and he's smoking a pipe. And about midway through the book, all of a sudden the photographs change, and there is Owen with a shaved head, no beard, and the picture of him is sitting there with a pair of pants, and it says something like the daily ritual, which is he is squeezing or squishing lice. He's killing the lice. And I think that lice and journeys, was part of the operation. Anyway, so they continue down this western side of China and go over the mountains, the Himalayas, into Kashmir. Now that is what we call the 5 highest passes of the Himalayas, through the Karakoram Pass, which is at 17,000 feet, which they do at this point with yaks, because yaks like to be up in the mountains, whereas horses don't. And Eleanor, according to our family legend anyways, is the first white woman to ever cross those high passes into what is now modern day Pakistan, and down into Kashmir, and then continue on to India, and then by steamer to Rome by way of the Suez Canal. In Rome, they stay in an apartment at the base of the Spanish Steps, which they live there for a year, writing their books. And I just think that's all so terribly romantic, the idea of, this great journey together, through all kinds of conditions, and then finally ending up in Rome and living at the Spanish Steps. It's just a beautiful story. And I always think that somebody ought to make a movie out of this. At that point, they, after spending a year in Rome writing their books, I think they were smart. They planned things out. They knew what they were doing, that they wanted to, publish these books and arrive on the scene. And they didn't just, go to England and start looking for people to help them out. They arrived in England with their books written, really ready to make an entrance, as it were. And they did that. They found people, they introduced themselves to people. He was eventually invited to speak for the Royal Geographic Society. And that led to going to Harvard for a year, where he studied on a fellowship, and then back to China, where he began to do more academic study and such. But just as a journey itself, I thought was incredible. Another journey was in the 1940s, when he was working for Chiang Kai-shek. After his first stint with Chiang Kai-shek, he flew home. Originally, he was supposed to fly from Hong Kong and take the route eastward. However, the flight from Hong Kong was on December 9th, 1941. And fortunately, he was unable to leave Chongqing due to weather. And of course, at that point, the Japanese attacked Hong Kong, and that route was no longer available. And it was probably a good thing that he wasn't there, or he would have spent the next 4 years in an internment camp. Instead, he flew, it took, I think it was about a month later, but he flew, and if I look at this, he flew Pan American Airlines over the hump into Burma, Calcutta, to Karachi, to Iran. And this is a plane that is going up and down, landing at one city after another. It's not a flight that you would just get on one and get off of another. It seems that he would fly to one city and then probably go stay in a hotel and be there for a few days, and then get the next flight to the next leg of his journey, from Karachi to Iran, then to Egypt, then to Gambia, and then on to Brazil, and then finally the last leg up into the United States. That journey lasted 3 weeks, and that was the quick journey by air from China to the United States. Working backwards a little bit, I wanted to talk about how the Lattimores got to China in the first place. If I go all the way back to the American Civil War, Owen's grandfather was a first cousin of Mary Lincoln Todd, or Mary Todd Lincoln. And as such, when the Lincolns came into their presidency, all the first cousins and relatives flocked to Washington looking for patronage jobs. And he worked there. This was Alexander Lattimore. He worked for the procurement department in the Army. And he had 4 children that I know of: John, Mary, David, and Alexander. John got himself into trouble. John was sort of reaching about. He wanted to be an officer in the Army, but that wasn't available to him. And he eventually ended up in a job in the post office. And he embezzled money. He stole money out of envelopes that were coming through. And I guess it was quite a bit of money, because when he was caught and convicted, the family was given the choice of jail or restitution. And the family paid back the money to the post office, but this really impoverished the family. John joined the Army as a private and then ended up in the Philippines fighting in the insurrection in the Philippines, and eventually became a police officer in the Philippines. Mary was studying with Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, and was very interested in education for the deaf because he had married a woman who was deaf. She became a Presbyterian missionary and traveled to China in 1888 and taught and worked in Nanking at a school for the deaf. She helped set it up and she taught there. Eventually, she was transferred to Tuk Memorial Hospital, which is in Suzhou, and she was there from 1898 until she died in 1917. She's the one who told her brother David, who was teaching high school. He had married and was teaching high school, not making a whole lot of money, was looking for some kind of an opportunity. I imagine high school teachers, we don't make much money now. I can't imagine what it was like in Washington, D.C. back then. And she said, well, there are opportunities here. And she paved the way for him. He went to China in 1901 with 2 young children. Owen was born in 1900 in Washington, D.C., and his older sister, Catherine. So they traveled to China in 1901, and David Lattimore became a teacher at a normal school and eventually ended up at the University of Shenzhen as a professor of modern languages. And he stayed there until 1921 when he was recruited to teach at Dartmouth and spent the rest of his career teaching in Dartmouth, teaching Chinese and Chinese history. So that is how the Lattimores got to China. Finally, I wanted to tell one last story, and this was to do with Owen's legacy. When he died, he asked that his ashes be spread in the mountains in Mongolia. Unfortunately, by the time I headed out to Mongolia, his ashes had been buried in a graveyard for quite some time, and I just didn't have it in me to go dig them up. So instead, I took an old watch that he had. You can imagine it's an old wristwatch on a metal band. And I took this watch with me, and when we went down to the Gobi, we went to the mountains there to the Yulin River, which is known as a gorge in a national park. And in the wintertime, the gorge fills with ice and snow, and then as it melts, it turns into this long ice tunnel, and it's something that people like to go to. So we went there, and I was wanting to go up into up onto the top into the mountains, but in the gorge that wasn't possible at all because it was just sheer cliffs, and you'd be insane to try and climb them. However, there was a place where these 2 rivers came together, something what we would call 3 rivers in this country. 2 rivers come together and they form a 3rd river, and there really was barely any water of them at that time. It was in August. And there was a nice little mountain that I could scramble up. So up that I went. And as I went up to the top, first thing I did was disturb a ginormous hawk. Mongolians have these really big hawks. And every time I tell this story, I think the hawk gets a little bit bigger. The hawk I set off, and I was really afraid that I'd really picked off this hawk and he was going to come and dive bomb me, something that happened to me once before up in Maine when I'd upset an osprey. And it's a thrilling experience, but a little bit scary when a hawk starts coming at you. However, this hawk took off and left me alone. And I got to the top and it was absolutely beautiful. You know, when you get to the top of a mountain and you have a view of the whole range of mountains before you, and it was sunset. So we had a beautiful sunset going down, and at the same time, the full moon was coming up. And so I took his watch, and I had a blue scarf that I had bought, and that was really thanks to one of my hosts, Sadie White, who had taken me shopping and said, "This is what you need." And so I had the scarf, and I bent down and I dug a little hole, and I put the scarf there and put the watch on, and I said, well, this, you know, I should take some pictures. So I you know, took some panoramic pictures of the sunset and the moon. And then I bent down and I said, well, I should take a picture of this watch. And when I bent down to look at the watch and take the picture, the watch was going. The second hand had started up. And, you know, this was a watch that had been sitting around for decades and had never run since. And so I took that as a sign that Owen knew that he had come back to Mongolia. So that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That I think it's a difficult one to follow up. Amazing. It was also really awesome to hear your additional details on the family history. I was just looking at the book. I think the author was Newman, and he gives a lot of the details about David Lattimore and the journey, but he leaves out a lot about anything about Mary, and of course anything about what Eleanor was doing before she met Owen. So really cool to hear those extra details from you. So our final speaker is going to be Dr. Myagmar Saruul-Erdene. And Dr. Saruul-Erdene has a PhD in linguistics and works as Mongolian specialist librarian in the Asian and Middle Eastern Division at the Library of Congress. And I just saw somebody in the chat who was talking about some holdings at the Library of Congress. So perhaps that will come up in his talk. Saruul-Erdene is also the special correspondent of the Mongolian Daily News, or Udrin Sonin, based in Washington, D.C., and he is a board member of the American Center for Mongolian Studies. Dr. Saruul-Erdene has also previously been a Mongolian language instructor at the Foreign Service Institute, U.S. Department of State from 2007 to 2019, visiting scholar at Indiana University from 2002 to 2007, and also a lecturer at the Mongolian State University of Education between 1994 and 2002. Dr. Saruul-Erdene?
Thank you very much, Marissa Smith. First of all, I want to thank ACMS, American Center for Mongolian Studies, for organizing this wonderful webinar about Professor Owen Lattimore. And I want to share my PowerPoint, and I want to talk with this PowerPoint about Owen Lattimore. I will talk about Owen Lattimore as a establisher of Mongolian community in the US, and maybe in the also Mongolian studies in the US too. So can you see my PowerPoint, my display?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay, good, thank you. So Mongolian community in the USA, now is unofficial statistics say around 30,000 Mongolians live in the United States, and in some kind of official statistics from Pew Research Center says in 2015 there were 21,000 Mongols in the US. So when we talk about Mongols in US, the very first Mongols were Kalmyks, and they are mostly in New Jersey and Pennsylvania area, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And how about the Mongolian, like independent Mongolian Mongolia, like Halkha? Most people say Halkha Mongols, but there are not lots of not Halkha Mongols there. So about those communities, so we lay most biggest one in Chicago, and then San Francisco, Oakland area, and then maybe third biggest is, we say, like 5,000 to 6,000 Mongols live in Washington DC area, and then Denver, Los Angeles, and Seattle. So those are the biggest community in the Mongolian community in the USA. And then we have Mongolian schools, Mongolian official organizations, and for my organization, for example, the Mongolian Cultural Center, etc. And but let's think about how that Mongolian community that originated. Who were the very first Mongolians in the United States? Here, very first to Mongolia. Chahar Mongol Hangen Gombchov here, and then Dagur Mongol Onungurgungo here. And here, our speaker, Owen Lattimore's father, Dr. David Lattimore. And as Dilawa Hotuktu called him butt building. And then I see him in our audience. Thank you very much for participating in it. So everybody would ask, like, hey, what is this photo? Yeah, this is the Library of Congress photo in our Owen Lattimore collection. So those two were very first Mongolians. It was 1948. And then, of course, Professor Owen Lattimore brought them. So that's how Mongolian community, story of the Mongolian community started here. And then the very first Mongolian religious leader in the USA, or Dilawa Gegen Hotuktu, very famous among Mongols. He came in 1948, and again, of course, Professor Owen Lattimore brought him. This photo is taken in at the other side of the photo, it says 1948, 1st of March. And then very late February, it says that I read that Dilawa Hotuktu came to USA. So that means it's 1st of March. That means, I think, seeing this picture, I think it's the very first picture photo of the Dilawa Hotuktu after he landed in the United States of America, I think. Maybe it was in Washington, D.C., or Evan or David Lattimore can correct me first. So, very first Mongolian religious leader, not only the Mongols of our Mongols, Kalmyk, and then, so how this, that is the story that how all the very first three Mongols came, Onungurgungo, Hangen Gomju, and Dilawa Hotuktu. And then the other Mongols came. So Dilawa Hotuktu, the Owen Lattimore brought Dilawa Hotuktu, and then Dilawa Hotuktu himself brought Jambal Dorje, the Lama who died recently after 103 years. 100. When he was died, he was 103 years old. And then Da Lama Namjil Dorje, and then Ashir Dara Hovlgan Tuvdu Minjur. So then those disciples of Dilawa Hotuktu, they brought other Mongols. So Jamtswe, who's Jamtswe's son, the Palji, is still in he's in Connecticut. I saw him very recently. Zorgi Gigen, Lufson Hayativ in San Francisco, Choi Jamts Lama, Yondun Jamts Lama, who worked with the Jambal Dorje Lama for a long time, and the Tsorje Lama, etc. So all those people who brought whom, how it's, I don't know exact process, but the Owen Lattimore brought Dilawa Hotuktu, Dilawa Hotuktu brought them, and then Teudoi brought them back then. So that's the story of Mongolian community, how Mongolian community, how Mongolian people, Mongols first came to the United States. Okay, so now today we have lots of Mongolian organizations, Mongolian Culture Center, those cities that I mentioned have Mongolian schools. Some of them has 3, 4 schools, etc. But during the Iron Curtain time, there were not many Mongolian-related organizations in the United States. So I can mention only 3 of them. And then let's see all the three of them who were the initiators. The Kalmyk started to come to in the US from in the 1950s. So very first, from 1950 December until 1951 June, 700 Kalmyks came to the United States. So they opened their very first temple in the Freewood Acres. Who helped them? That monetary help aid came from the daughter of Lev Tolstoy, very famous Russian author, writer, Lev Tolstoy, the Lev Tolstoy. Lev Tolstoy's youngest daughter, Alexandra Tolstoya, helped them, and then this was the very first Mongolian Kalmyk temple, and the first primate lama was Dilavahotukto. So it's the religion story, right? And then after 1961, after Mongolia became a member of United Nations, Mongolian Society in Bloomington, Indiana was established. And then the very first president was Owen Lattimore himself. And then another organization in 1988, Mongolian American Cultural Association, MACA, still very active, working, and Sanjay Altunga is working in the Palji and Tsagambatar. But one of the two establishers, the main organizer the founder was Hangin Gomcho. So only three active organizations worked during the social system when the Mongolia was far from United States. All Owen Lattimore, himself or someone who brought, they initiated those things. Okay, so that's in this case, it's very clear that Owen Lattimore is the establisher of Mongolian community in the United States. Let's talk about a little bit about Mongolian studies in the United States. So in the 50s, very early in the 50s, those four universities were very active, had very active Mongolian studies. Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and University of Washington and Indiana University. Before that, yeah, we can mention William Wood Rockhill as a Mongolist, and Jeremiah Curtin from US. We can call him also Mongolist. But as an institutional level, those four. So Johns Hopkins, of course, Owen Lattimore established their Mongolian studies. In Harvard, Francis Woodman Cleaves. And the University of Washington, Nicholas Poppe was there. And in Indiana University, Dennis Senior was invited to establish their Mongolian studies, not only Mongolian studies, Central Eurasian studies. And sometime later, only Indiana University continued their Mongolian studies. And then for a long time, Professor John Kruger was the main scholar Mongolist there. And then now, and still for a long time, Kara George, Professor Kara, and then Hangin Gomji was teaching Mongolian language there. And right now, UPenn is another important Mongolian language center, and Professor Christopher Atwood is working there. Okay, I can't mention all of the Mongolists here. I'm sorry if I can't name important ones, but just a few examples. Let's see who's disciple, how these Mongolian studies professors introduced in Mongolian studies in the United States. Whose knowledge from whom? Who's disciple of whom? Okay, so Harvard University, Francis Cleaves. Francis Cleaves is disciple from Paul Pilio. Francis went to Paris in 1936. He studied under Paul Pilio in Mongolian studies, and after that he went to Beijing and studied under Anton Mostert, under or together, like as the disciple and / friend, and then brought Mongolian studies to Harvard University. University of Washington, Nicholas Poppe. Nicholas Poppe is himself not an American. He's a Russian, and he's, if you will go back, Leningrad-style Mongolian studies, and Boris Vladimirov. In Indiana University, Dennis Jr., he's not also American. He's a Hungarian Mongolist. And his knowledge, he's also Paul Pilio's disciple. So Paul Pilio is here. And then John Kruger later, he's the disciple of Poppe, and Poppe goes to Boris Vladimir, right? And then Professor Kara George Hartorch Bakshi is the disciple of Laish Legati, and then Laish Legati is disciple of Paul Pillier. And in a UPenn, Christopher Atwood Bakshi calls, he studied under Francis Cleves and also undergraduate and then graduate schools and with Professor Kara. So Kara goes back to Laish Legati goes to Paul Pillier, Christopher Atwood, Francis Cleves, and Cleves teacher is. So Paul Pillier is very important in the Mongolian studies in the United States. But okay, in the case of, if we talk is like American Mongolian studies, without like whose discipline, where did get their knowledge from? Owen Lattimore, only Owen Lattimore. We can't say like Owen Lattimore's Mongolian studies teacher was that. We can't say because he initiated himself, he educated himself, and this Professor Nordby and Professor Humphrey, they said even his most important book called Mongol Journey, he went there himself, he studied himself. So in this case, if we talk about like Mongolian studies in the United States, so Owen Lattimore is like one who self-educated, like American who really started Mongolian studies in Johns Hopkins. Okay, there's bad stories with Evan talked about this bad stories with about McCarthy, etc. And then Professor Humphrey also talked about this American side, State Department or from senators said application for him was not very good. But good thing is from Mongolian side that there was a different Mongolia. So in 1961, Mongolian Academy of Sciences established. And before that was called Learned Committee and also Institute of Science, etc. So in 1969, they chose their very first foreign member. And then the ceremony happened in 96, September 18. And Lattimore was the very first foreign member of Academy of Science. No one from Soviet Union or any other socialist countries. Lattimore was the first one. And Owen Lattimore was very happy that after that event, he was officially called by Mongols Labakshi. And then in his letter he wrote, that is a big honor for me because only 3 people called in such way in Mongolia. In such way means like first syllable, nothing else. So Ri Bakshi is Rinching, Ta Bakshi is Demdisurum, and Lo Bakshi is Lofsumanda, Jatwin Lofsumanda. So only those 3 was called like this. And then 4th one is foreigner, just not foreigner, American, La Bakshi. So he was very happy. And that's the very first academician, member of the Academy of Mongolia is Lattimore. And then if you go back to a little bit history, when in 1925, the Learned Committee, the organization before Mongolian Academy of Science, they had also their own very first members. Sotarbichki Hurelin's very first 3 foreign members were Vladimirsov, Pelio, and Kotvich, Polish, French, and Russian scholars. So, but it was the different organization. The name was Sotarbichki Hurelin Learned Committee, and then after Academy of Science, the Labakshi was the very first one. And then again, my previous lecturers already mentioned it. Labakshi is also very first one from capitalist country who got Altangats, or Polar Star or North Star. Here is the very nice, funny letter to Walter Hassig. It's in the Library of Congress. And then a most unusual honor. He was very happy. And most unusual honor. I must be just about the only bourgeois capitalist recipient. I'm very proud of it. And he's writing to Walter Hassig in December 78. So that's his original decree from Zitumbol and Kotov. It's about awarding North Star Altangatus to Owen Lattimore. Okay, speaking of Sitambal, right after the Lattimore became very first academician, member of the Mongolian Science Academy. So the same month, Sitambal sent this letter and photo to Owen Lattimore. And then Sitambal's handwriting is very, very bad. So I feel sorry for Professor Lattimore. It was very hard to read it. So still, but possible. So he sent this, and then knowing Lattimore to know, Mr. Lattimore, I'm sending you this photo of 1944. 1944 оны нүхтийн ам хэмээх газар. The photo is taken in a place in a нүхтийн ам. It's in a Bogdol. So in Zorgik танд барья. I'll give you that. That photo. Далбааны дэргэд байгаа хүмүүсийг дурдвал. Let me introduce the people who are beside the American flag, the flags. Зөвлөлтийн элчин сайд E.A. Ivanov, the Russian ambassador Ivanov, Marshal Chobelson here, Marshal Chobelson, and then in parentheses Mongol Debelten, and then Noel Lattimore. Lattimore is here, and it is by the way, this photo is taken during the vice president's visit to Mongolia. And then Sitambal, Sirikov's there, and then Sirikov's the Sitam. So okay, those are the examples of the honor that Mongolian government paid to Owen Lattimore. Even his own government did not appreciate his works, but from Mongolian government did. That's it for me, and thank you very much. And if you have any questions, maybe I can answer that. Thank you, ACMS.
Thank you, Dr. Saruul-Erdene. That was amazing. Yeah, so we're going to go to questions now. We've had a few coming in. I think some people probably waited until the end of the presentations to put questions in the chat. So I'm going to stay with you really quickly because there was actually someone who asked already about the papers of Owen Lattimore that are in the Library of Congress, and I think you just mentioned some things from that collection. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about that collection?
Okay. Yes, Professor Lattimore's papers. It's huge. It's big. It's in a Library of Congress manuscript division. It's possible for public. Unfortunately, Library of Congress is closed now for pandemic. I don't know when it will be open. And it's I don't know exactly. Maybe it's more than 100 files. Each file has lots of papers. All his correspondences, everything is there. And I think Newman, who wrote a book about Lattimore, Owen Lattimore and the Loss of China, he had all this information, all this archive, and then he gave it to Library of Congress. So it's, yes, that's true in Library of Congress. And then so many interesting letters I have found from there. Dilava Khotkhtu's letters. Dilava Khotkhtu's letters were very good for filing. Library of Congress librarians very good for filing all the things that under the name, correspondence, and the year. But the Mongol Bichik, no one read Mongol Bichik. So everything in the Mongol Bichik or Tibetan or everything, they just foreign, and then put in a one big file. So it's very difficult to find something from there. And fortunately, I found them, and then I will work later. Yeah, I will put in good places all the letters.
Wow, thank you very much. I'm also just going to share that person who had submitted their comment on the ACMS website. So their full comment is there, but also they had shared a PDF of the finding aid that I think lists at least the things that are not in Mongol Bichik. I will also just put that in the chat for everyone to see. I also wanted to give a chance to the panel respondents. Did anyone want to, did the four of you have any questions for one another?
I have a question.
Yes.
Evan, do you know what happened to those paintings? Or David, the wonderful paintings that Owen used to have in his house near Leeds?
A lot of his furniture traveled across the ocean several times, and he had many Chinese pieces of furniture and painting. They ended up in my father's house in Lincoln, Massachusetts, where I believe they still are. I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I just thought they were, they must have been quite early, valuable paintings of Mongols, and those things are quite rare. And so I just thought it would be wonderful to know where they are. Yeah.
Well, and he also had many books that were in Mongolian and Cyrillic. He had photographs. Some of the photographs, the glass plate photographs, ended up at Harvard. His books, my father had for a while. There's a lot of things that, of course, ended up at the Library of Congress. So, yes.
I think David wants to speak. Looks like his mic is muted.
David?
I'll unmute myself.
Oh,
Can
thank you very
hear me
much.
now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, a couple of pictures of Mongolians have been sold and have gone, I believe, back to China. There's a big one that of a sort of a tribute mission that's a mid-19th century Chinese painting, but of various sorts of Central Asian figures bringing presumably tribute to the emperor or something. And that we have had restored. It was not in very good condition. It's in wonderful condition now, but it's not yet framed, so it's in a box in my house. And we have given away a lot of costumes, clothing, Chinese and Mongolian, to members of my family, my grandchildren, children and grandchildren. The same is true of their silver-lined bowls. There was quite a collection of those. Those, again, have been distributed among family members, and there's some that I still have here. Just the other day, my daughter Claire was visiting from Alaska, where she lives and is a nurse practitioner. And I've given her things from time to time, and also other family members. But I had the last thing that the Dilif had to give away from his own possessions was an ivory cylindrical piece of ivory tusk, elephant tusk, that was hollow and had a little panel in it on which you could rub snuff, which would then fall down into the ivory container. And I gave that to her. She has some other Mongol knives and things. Neither she nor the Delaf took snuff, I'm sure. And it was from Manchuria. That's all I know. He said it was a Manchu snuff roller. So that is now near Anchorage, Alaska, in Bird Creek, Alaska. Claire has, and other children, Mike and so on, have other things, and they've all received some Mongolian and Chinese costumes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I actually had a question in the chat from Dr. Veronika Kapiszowska, who is at the Charles University in Prague, Department of Mongolian Studies, and I think I saw her on the call earlier. Are you there? If you're there, I'll just let you ask your own question. If not, I will do it.
I'm here.
And oh, hi, great. Would you like to ask your question?
You can ask a question. Your English is better than mine.
No, please. I saw you giving presentations in English the other day, and it was amazing.
Okay. So thank you very much for all the panelists and participants. It was very interesting to hear the memories and rememberings of Owen Lattimore, whose books are really very wonderful source for us to read. And I wanted to ask whether you remember Mr. Lattimore to mention, or whether he had written after he came back to Europe or to America, anything about how Mongolian language possibly have changed since the times he used to live there, or any linguistic things?
Yeah, well, he may have talked about that, but I don't recall him specializing. He wasn't particularly interested in language change, I don't think. Of course, he would have learnt primarily Mongol when he was in Inner Mongolia initially, but I recall him speaking absolutely fluently when he was in Half Mongolia. So he must have had some way of doing that. But I don't remember him talking about really sort of 20th century changes or communist vocabulary or anything like that. Okay. I mean, I think he just absorbed it and used it, but didn't particularly remark on it. But maybe Judith has more information on that.
Right, okay, right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, right, okay. I keep getting funny messages on my screen. So the question is whether he noticed any differences in the language over time. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Hello, Nika. I think that what was important to him was understanding what people were saying, and the nuances behind what they were saying. I mean, I certainly never heard him discussing Mongolian from a linguistic aspect, but it's not to say that he didn't, of course. But I think it was the importance of language as a tool for mutual understanding that really got him into the language. And so, I mean, I do remember him saying one time, I mean, this is not Mongolian, this actually is to do with Chinese, but he was sitting, when he would sit with the Chiang Kai-shek at night, And he said that Chiang Kai-shek didn't say very much until his wife left, because he didn't want his wife to hear what he was saying to Lattimore. And I think that rather illustrates his sense of the importance of not just the language, but the nuances. Does that help?
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, not exactly answer for Nick's question, but I recently visited Francis Woodman Cleave's library and read his correspondences and some of his letters to Lattimore and also to Poppe. And then Poppe and Cleaves are writing each other, and one thing is very clear, that when they were talking, they were all trying to teach Khalkha Mongolian, Ulaanbaatar centered Mongolian language, but only one who can speak that dialect was Dilaw Khotkto. And then Owen Lattimore had not only Dilaw Khotkto, so Owen Lattimore at that time has like treasure, like all Daur Mongolian, Chakra Mongolian, and only Khalkha Mongolian dialects. So Cleaves' questions about, Cleaves is very good about the old Mongolian language, literature and everything. But what's going on right now in the Mongolian language? He had only two sources. One is Dilaw Khotkto. For Dilaw Khotkto, he wrote to Owen Lattimore, and the other one is Poppe. Poppe himself was in Ulaanbaatar 2-3 times, and his Khalkha dialect is very good. So yeah, it's not about your question, but it was very interesting to read those letters that Owen Lattimore and Dilaw Khotkto, they were together were kind of only resource for Khalkha Mongolian dialect, like live language.
And this is very important.
And actually, I've just remembered something else about Lattimore and language. When he was older and he retired actually to Cambridge for quite a few years, he got very interested in the kind of origin of words, and he would pick out a Mongolian word and say, well, this comes from that, and it indicates that, particularly sort of place names or things like that, or names for techniques. He'd try and trace a sort of genealogy on particular words, and it often seemed to me a little bit kind of airy. I mean, I don't know that there was how much basis he had for this, but he loved doing it. And I have several letters from him in which he'd expound on such and such a word must have come from something, and an influence from so and so, and a Persian origin to this, all that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Am I still audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Am I? Okay. My father had a sort of lifelong friendly rivalry with his younger brother, Richmond Lattimore, who was well-known in the 50s, 60s, 70s for his Greek translations, and who was opposite to my father in many respects. He was my father never went to college. Richmond was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and took a double first in Greats, the first American to do that. And their mother, my grandmother, used to say, Richmond is a real scholar. Owen just likes to learn languages because he can't bear not to understand what people are saying.
Yeah.
He also had when he was working for Chiang Kai-shek's Mandarin Chinese was extremely difficult for many people to understand. Chiang Kai-shek's native dialect was Ningbo, and it just happened that my father's first nursemaid in China, Ama, was from Ningbo, so his baby steps in Chinese were in Ningbo dialect himself, and he no longer had real knowledge of Ningbo, but he had the ability to interpret the Chiang Kai-shek's mispronunciations or Ningbo influenced pronunciations, of which many Chinese couldn't understand, but he understood. Still, just buried in his head somewhere was a knowledge of the Ningbo sounds and how to link them up with other dialects. And he could understand Chiang Kai-shek's speech better than many Chinese could. He said that, he said himself that from the Mongol journeys period of his life, he felt that he was really accepted as a normal Central Asian person when he'd been traveling at night with Eleanor, my mother, and they knocked on a door to see if they could get lodgings for a night in a Mongolian, I suppose, dwelling. And he knocked on the door and there was a lot of barking, and the Mongolian called out, you know, "Nohoigon," or whatever you say, to call off your dogs. And then a man stuck his head out, and the man's wife inside said, who is this person? Who is there out there? And the householder said, "Oh, it's a Tianjin Chinese merchant with a Russian wife," he said.
Well, I think everyone has done a really fabulous job drawing out the importance of studying Mongolian and spending time in the country, and really highlighting that as a legacy of Owen Lattimore. And I think that's also something that ACMS has really contributed a lot to, at least in recent years. So I think that's a really wonderful theme that's come out of this presentation. We did have someone in the chat who was Daniel Lang, who actually I know a bit, because he was just, if I may say more about him, he was doing Peace Corps where I did field work. So he recently got in touch with me in the past year. And actually, I think that, Daniel, I think you're on the chat. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. So I'm very, very new to the academic side of Mongolia studies, but as an undergrad, I was a journalism student and I'd done Chinese studies. And so Peace Corps assigned me to Mongolia, and pretty much being there, teaching English there, community development, all the Peace Corps activities, I'd really found an interest for me in Mongolia. So without having studied it as an undergrad and just being there, I've wanted to learn more about how I might go about maybe postgraduate experiences in perhaps anthropological or historical studies of Mongolia, particularly field work. I really like going places, talking to people. So any advice, and this could be also, you can email me. I put my email in the chat just because I know it's been a long talk today. But yeah, I'm very new and very interested. Oh, and actually I meant to add too, I read the A Monastery in Time book as a Peace Corps volunteer and felt very shocked to learn, oh, the author is here. So just, that was part of my introduction.
Great, glad you read it.
Yes.
I also recommended he read Shamans and Elders, which he wrote with Urgunga Onen, so.
Thank you. Well, I could say that we do have a course in Cambridge if you ever felt like coming over the other side of the Atlantic. And there are several people here who do research on Mongolia and the countries around Mongolia, and we teach the language too, and you'd be very welcome. Yep. Perhaps I could also mention, since we've been talking earlier about archives and things, that Lattimore's collection of books, I think some of it went back to the States, probably the majority, but he left quite a lot here in Cambridge. And there's a collection called the Lattimore Collection, which is now housed in the Oriental, it used to be, it's now called Far Eastern Studies Library in Cambridge, which he sort of left to us, but we were kind of tiny little group then, and those Far Eastern guys, they had a big library, so they took it all, and it's sitting there. It's got quite a few very valuable books, because he was a collector of books, and he had some excellent early major studies of China and Mongolia. They're all there. And then there's this sort of uncatalogued, so far, more or less uncatalogued collection of articles and papers that he also left in Cambridge. And they're available. And somebody's listed them, but they're not online as a collection. But you could, anybody interested could go and look at those. And they were just part of his personal collection. And he had, David has already mentioned, a huge collection of photographs that he took during his journeys. And they also somehow, he said, should come to Cambridge, but in the end, they've ended up in the Peabody Museum, I think, in Harvard.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
That's right. And however, the Peabody people gave us a copy of them all. So we have that too. And there are collections in Cambridge of, there was somebody called Ethel John Lindgren Utsi, who was a traveler in Mongolia in the 20s, together with a Swedish photographer, and thousands of her photographs we also have here, and they make a very interesting kind of relation with the Lattimore photos. They're not exactly the same period, they're not even the same places exactly, but if somebody was interested in the kind of history of Mongolia of that period, 10s and 20s and early 30s, there's a huge amount in the archives over here.
There's also some of her photographs and other materials are also at Stanford. I don't know what the relation is, but anyway.
Can I add? I think that there's stuff all over the place that belong to this complex of Lattimore stuff. We have a certain amount of material in Leeds. Although Agunga always used to say that it was just the junk that Leeds got. But this is in a special collections. A section of the library, and if anyone's interested to know more about it, I can certainly find out when we're allowed back into the university. But I also learned recently that apparently at the University of Hull, which of course is not so far from Leeds, there's a Lattimore archive. Again, I don't know what it involves, but it would certainly be possible to find out. I think actually that might have been mentioned in Newman's book, which incidentally is accessible on the internet. It's amazing how much stuff you can find there these days.
Yeah, so related to that too, someone just asked in the chat about the documentary that Owen Lattimore made. That is actually, it's been circulating a lot on YouTube, so a lot of people have been talking about it again. But could anyone speak a bit about that?
Disappearing World.
Yeah.
disappearing world, because that used to be compulsory viewing both for students of Mongolian and the Mongolian exchange students. The Mongolian exchange students used to say, well, it's a very nice film, but this is not our life, because they were all from rather elite families in Ulaanbaatar. But we couldn't get a copy. We couldn't get a copy of that eventually. I think the one we had, it just melted. It just disappeared. And I don't think Granada kept a copy eventually, because we tried to get one from them. But you say you'd seen it on the internet?
Yeah, I will put it in the chat on YouTube. So somebody had a copy somewhere and put it on.
Somebody had a copy somewhere. Send me an email, please.
I will. Yes.
Interesting.
I think
I can't keep up with all these things on the chat.
I believe they showed it in Morris Rossaby's summer NEH seminar that I took. So Rossaby must know where to get it.
And also there are very nice interviews that Professor Humphrey, that one of the lecturers interviewed Professor Owen Lattimore. They are, I watched I think I watched in YouTube or I forgot, but it was in the internet. Yeah, very good.
Yes, that's true. I'd forgotten about that. I should have mentioned it. Yes, I did interview him for quite a long time. I remember it was in the winter in a freezing cold barn, and we were both sitting shivering like this. Yeah, no, I did interview him, and that was yeah, interesting thing.
Thank you. That was very good, very informative. This, yes.
Yeah, it's on Alan McFarlane's YouTube channel.
Yes.
Oh, I see.
That's where it is. Yep.
Well, I have the link to that, so if anyone wants it, get in touch with me. I can just pass you on the link, because I found that very interesting. In 2013, East Asian Studies celebrated 50 years of the department, and we did an awful lot. Well, in fact, I did an awful lot of research on on departmental history, and Owen Lattimore, and he was a very big focus in the celebrations. We had about a week's long of celebrations, including a memorial bicycle ride to the house that Caroline mentioned, out in the country, which one of his colleagues still lives in. Actually, Brian Hook still lives there.
No. And Judith, thank you for remembering. It was Derek Pritchett I was thinking of.
Yes, well, he lives his house is just around the corner from me, and I mean he's maintained his although he worked in the psychology department for years, he maintained his interest in Mongolian studies, and of course cooperated with Gunga on the book Asia's Modern Revolution. He also did a bit of teaching on the program. He did a few of the history lectures for me when I was running the program.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions I had in the chat. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to ask, or were we good to wrap up? I think it's getting on to be just over past the hour now, so people are starting to head off to their next engagements.
Well, you will be ready to start your day.
Yeah, it's actually light outside now.
Well, this has been very interesting. Yeah.
But can I add something?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's nice to hear all of those wonderful presentations. And based on the speeches delivered by David Lattimore and Saruul-Erdene, I have one idea. about implementing wonderful projects in future. For instance, there are many unpublished, unstudied manuscripts in the Library of Congress. Also, there are many paintings and cultural heritages in endangered condition. That's why maybe to implement projects to document and to save all of those manuscripts and paintings. There are foundations supporting to preserve cultural heritage everywhere. For instance, I think there are many foundations, but I don't know names. At least the Embassy of America every year announces project proposal to preserve cultural heritage, and with such foundation, with supports of such foundations, can people implement projects to document all of those. Another thing is David Lattimore and Owen Lattimore talked lots of wonderful memories, and maybe also not only documenting manuscripts, researching manuscripts, but also interviewing and collecting all of those. Maybe I think, for instance, David Lattimore has got many unspeeched and speech talks to tell to us, to everyone who study Mongolian issues. Maybe also it's good to document all of document and keep and introduce to future generation all of those wonderful knowledge and memories. Okay, it's just my idea. Just during the, I didn't prepare to ask and to say this, but I think you understood what do I mean. Yeah, my idea is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dutch.
Okay.
Thank you.
Also, I'm really very much interested in seeing all of those old Mongolian manuscripts kept in the Library of Congress. Maybe.
Thank you very much. Maybe ACMS can initiate such a project. Yeah. ACMS doing a lot about. So.
Also, such a wonderful universities.
Yeah. Also, there's other libraries in the U.S. as well that are sort of Ferdinand Lessing's and also Walter Heisig's. So yeah, there are a lot in the U.S. and definitely.
Oh yeah, another thing
ACMS.
is yeah, Dialog also met, as I read, as I remember right. Currently, I'm reading Larsen Duke's travel record, and also Dialog was a close person to Larsen Duke. That's why also Dialog research on Dialog can be also extended. I don't know.
Yeah, if I could jump in. Thank you, Ikunta, for your question. Just so you know, we here, if you're based in Ulaanbaatar, we here at the American Center for Mongolian Studies, we have, as we've been mentioning at the chat, we have over 24 books written and edited by Owen Lattimore, and I do believe we have at least one book that is The Memoir and Autobiography of Dilokhotucht, translated by Owen Lattimore. So we have that in paperback. If you're based in UB, feel free to come to visit our library and check the book out. It's maybe a little plug of our membership. We are a member supported organization. So by becoming a member, you would be able to, check the books out as a home loan, for example. But MongoliaCenter.org is our website, so feel free to check that out.
Yeah, I know. I have been a member of the American Center for Mongolian Studies for some years, but still now I receive newsletters, and currently I'm living in Germany, and of course I have read and I have some books by Owen Lattimore, and the Dilokhotucht's book I don't have. I would love to get one if I could, and also I can donate some volumes of my books. No, some copies of my books. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very wonderful to hear.
I can jump in also. So, that's you have excellent suggestions, and the ACMS would be interested, of course, do more things. So I'm very happy to see all panel participants. It's very interesting presentation and stories. For me, is learning, so I think so we hear about, all these sources and books and photos, all different places, and maybe we could do like museum exhibition. That would be, much broader public, also to learn about Lattimore's work. So along with the exhibits, we can organize some programs. Could be another conference. I mean, there's so much of topics, areas we could cover. So and I really enjoyed the presentations and talks. And Evan, you brought up dinosaurs. So, I'm a paleontologist, so I think I should, say the name of the dinosaur. It's called Goya-cephali. It's a Pachycephalosaurus. It's a plant-eating dinosaur, and dinosaur that was found from Umunhoi region and named by our very famous paleontologist Pirle, along with his Polish colleagues. So they named this dinosaur in honor of Owen Lattimore. So it's called Goya-cephali Lattimore. So it's fun to find that there's some connection that I'm connecting through my field of area. So I think so I learned a lot. So I really enjoyed the today's panel, and at the ACMS, we want to do more, and so like Toya suggested, and I think there's many other programs and things we can do, and especially the source of information that is all across different institutions and universities. Those that really need to be documented. If we could have digital access all in one place, it will be so helpful to scholars and researchers and students who get to access to it. So I think this is something we need to work all together.
Yeah.